The defensive box at Arracourt was not a fortress in the old sense, with stone walls and permanent works waiting for an attacker. It was a battlefield arrangement built in haste around villages, roads, fields, mines, waterlogged ground, concealed weapons, and mutually supporting positions. After the withdrawal from Counteroffensive, Indian forces had to create a defensive shape that could absorb Pakistan's armored thrust without being split apart. The idea was not to stop every tank at the outer edge. It was to draw the attacking armor into a prepared zone where speed would fade, routes would narrow, and every attempt to push deeper would bring fire from another direction. That is why the phrase defensive box captures the battle so well. It suggests a space that looks open until the attacker discovers that the exits are closing. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore.
At the center of the problem was the Kem-Karan-Beeki Wind axis, the route that pointed from the border town into deeper Indian Punjab. Pakistan's armored plan needed this axis to become a road to decision. India needed it to become a road into resistance. The defensive box formed around Arracourt and nearby positions in a way that protected the approaches beyond Kem-Karan, while avoiding a brittle straight-line defense. A straight line can be pierced by mass and speed if the attacker finds a weak point. A box, by contrast, can create depth and overlapping danger. The attacker may enter it, but entry is not the same as breakthrough. The deeper he moves, the more he exposes his flanks, his rear, and his supply routes. For a listener without a map, it helps to imagine Indian defenders pulling back from the border and forming a rough defended zone behind Kem-Karan, with villages and fields serving as anchors. The Pakistanis would be advancing from the west and southwest, trying to push through Kem-Karan and then onward toward Beeki Wind and the Beas approaches. Indian infantry positions were not isolated dots. They were meant to support one another and to sit near the likely approaches of Pakistani armor. Indian tanks were not simply scattered behind the line. They were positioned to fire into routes where enemy vehicles would be slowed or channeled. Artillery was not merely waiting to bombard empty ground. It was meant to strike concentrations as the armored thrust lost freedom of movement.
The box depended on depth, because depth gives a defender time to recover from the first shock. If the forward edge is the whole defense, then once it breaks, the battle can collapse quickly. At Arracourt, the Indian aim was to make the Pakistani attack fight through a sequence of problems. A tank might pass one obstacle, only to meet another. A unit might push through a village edge, only to find fire from a flank. A column might leave the road to maneuver and then encounter soft ground or mines. In this kind of defense, no single feature has to be perfect. The strength comes from the way features combine. Mines, flooded patches, artillery, concealed tanks, and infantry strongpoints all increase one another's effect. Concealment was essential because the ground around Arracourt did not offer the kind of visibility that an armored attacker prefers. Sugarcane and other tall crops limited sightlines and gave defenders places to hide weapons and movement. Villages broke up the open country, while trees, embankments, and irrigation features created sudden changes in what a tank crew could see. A tank is a powerful machine, but its crew sees the battlefield through restricted viewpoints, especially under fire or with hatches closed. If the attacker cannot see clearly, he must either slow down, guess, or push ahead into uncertainty. The defensive box exploited that uncertainty. It made the Pakistani thrust search for the enemy instead of rolling over an enemy already exposed. The Indian armor inside and around the box had to be used with patience. A defender's tank should not always rush forward to meet an attacker in the open, especially when facing a heavy armored formation. It can be more effective when it waits in cover, fires from prepared ground, and shifts position only when necessary. Centurions, Shermans, and other armored elements had to serve the defensive plan rather than chase individual duels. Their task was to engage Pakistani tanks when those tanks were slowed, silhouetted, blocked, or turned by obstacles. This is a major lesson of armored warfare. A tank's value is not measured only by its own speed. Sometimes its greatest value comes from making the enemy move into its gun. Infantry gave the box its grip. Without infantry, defensive positions in villages and fields could be bypassed, cleared, or ignored. Infantrymen held ground, watched approaches, protected anti-tank weapons, and made it dangerous for enemy tanks to operate without their own close support. Anti-tank teams, machine guns, small arms, and local fire positions could separate Pakistani tanks from supporting infantry or make that support move cautiously. The soldier in a trench or beside a field edge might seem small compared with a Patton, but the tank still needed friendly infantry nearby to identify threats, clear resistance, and secure ground. When tanks advance into close country without that cooperation, they may retain firepower but lose confidence and awareness. Artillery tied the defensive box together over distance. It could reach places that infantry could not physically occupy and strike concentrations that appeared when vehicles were delayed by mines or soft ground. Artillery also added pressure to command and control. Shellfire can force crews to close down, make radio communication harder, scatter infantry support, and turn a temporary halt into a dangerous pause. Its value was not only in destroying tanks directly, though that could happen in some circumstances. Its wider value lay in disrupting the rhythm of the attack. Armored warfare is a struggle over tempo, and artillery is one of the defender's best tools for interrupting that tempo before the attacker can exploit a gap. Engineers remained central even after the first mines were laid and water was released. Obstacles are not static in the mind of a commander. They shape choices and must be understood as part of a continuing battle. Mines had to be covered, gaps watched, and routes protected from being cleared too easily. Flooded ground had to be interpreted correctly, because a patch that stops one vehicle may merely slow another, and a path that appears impossible may suddenly become usable under pressure. Engineers, infantry, and local commanders had to think about where the enemy would probe next. The defensive box was therefore not just a shape on paper, it was a living arrangement, adjusted by observation, fear, and opportunity. Pakistan's armored commanders faced a difficult reading problem as they approached this defensive zone. If Indian forces had truly broken and were only falling back in disorder, speed was the correct answer. If Indian forces had withdrawn into a prepared defensive box, speed without caution could become fatal. The trouble was that both situations can look similar in the opening hours. A retreating enemy tempts pursuit. An abandoned town invites exploitation. Roads into the defender's depth seem to promise success. But the deeper a force moves without understanding the defensive pattern, the more it risks entering a trap. At Asal-Uttar, Pakistan's plan required forward momentum, while India's defensive box was designed to make momentum suspicious. The box also shows why defensive success is not passive. Popular language often treats defense as waiting and attack as action, but that is misleading. The Indian defense around Asal-Uttar required movement, labor, coordination, and judgment. Men dug, shifted, scouted, registered artillery, adjusted positions, laid mines, prepared fields of fire, and tried to repair the damage caused by the earlier withdrawal. Commanders had to decide where to accept risk and where to concentrate strength. The defense was active because it sought to control what the attacker could do. Its purpose was not merely to endure Pakistani armor, but to shape the conditions under which Pakistani armor would be forced to fight. In the larger history of tank warfare, the defensive box at Asal-Uttar belongs to a long argument between breakthrough and containment. Tanks were invented to restore movement, to cross deadly ground and break static fronts. Yet every generation of defenders has learned ways to slow, channel, and punish them. By 1965, tanks were far more capable than their First World War ancestors, but they still depended on visibility, routes, logistics, infantry, and command tempo. At Asal Uttar, India's achievement was to deny the attacker the open, flowing battle that armor doctrine desired. The defensive box was not elegant because war is not elegant. It was effective because it turned local ground into a system and made the attacker's greatest strength, speed, increasingly hard to use.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.